Professor Quilnixarian adjusted his 17 academic medals and prepared to deliver what would surely be the most anticlimactic intellectual demonstration in galactic history. The greatest philosophical mind in the known universe, author of Infinite Recursions of Consciousness, and winner of the Zeta Reticuli Prize for Advanced Existential Theory, was about to debate a human. A human. The species that had only recently discovered fire wasn't even hyperbole anymore. It was just Tuesday. This should take approximately 14 minutes, Quill muttered to his aide, checking his chronometer. 12 minutes to establish the parameters of universal truth, 2 minutes for the human to concede defeat, and perhaps 30 seconds of polite applause before we can return to civilization. Meanwhile, at Riverside Community College, Tommy Briggs was having the worst day of his academic career, which was saying something considering he'd once turned in a book report on the dictionary because he'd forgotten to read the assigned novel. He'd been called out of his introduction to philosophy class, which he'd only taken because it fit his schedule between his shifts at Pete's Pizza Palace and his afternoon nap. Mr. Briggs, the dean, had said, looking more nervous than Tommy had ever seen him, "There's been a selection for an important academic event. Your name came up." What the dean didn't mention was that Tommy's name had come up because of a clerical error. The Galactic Academic Council had requested Earth's most representative philosophical mind, and somehow the paperwork had gotten mixed up with the student parking permit applications. Tommy Briggs, who'd written "I think therefore I am hungry" on his philosophy midterm, was now humanity's intellectual champion. The venue was the United Nations building, hastily converted into something resembling an academic coliseum. Alien dignitaries filled the audience, their various tentacles, eye stalks, and breathing apparatus creating a symphony of otherworldly sounds. At the center of it all sat two podiums, one occupied by a being that looked like a cross between a praying mantis and a university professor, and the other waiting for Tommy, who was currently in the bathroom trying to figure out if his backwards baseball cap was appropriate for whatever this thing is. Ambassador Vex, the debate moderator, represented the Galactic Academic Union and possessed the kind of calm authority that came from mediating disputes between civilizations. She'd overseen debates about the nature of time, the ethics of planetary consumption, and the proper pronunciation of Betelgeuse. This, however, was her first debate where one participant had asked if there would be snacks. The stakes, Ambassador Vex announced to the assembled crowd, are Earth's potential admission to the Galactic Academic Union. Should the human representative demonstrate sufficient intellectual capacity, your species will be granted access to the greatest collection of knowledge in the universe. Tommy, who had just returned from the bathroom, leaned into his microphone. "Cool. Do you guys have like a food court or something?" Quill's left antenna twitched. This was going to be easier than he'd thought. Part 2. First Contact Fumbles. The formal introductions began with all the pomp and circumstance befitting a galactic intellectual summit. Ambassador Vex gestured toward Quill with multiple appendages, each movement precise and meaningful in 17 different alien cultures. Representing the Galactic Academic Council, Professor Quilnixarian, holder of 47 advanced degrees, author of 12,000 published papers, and the first being to successfully prove that consciousness exists independent of physical form. Quill rose from his podium, his robes flowing dramatically, as he extended his primary greeting appendage in the traditional Nexarian salute. A complex gesture that conveyed respect, intellectual humility, and a deep appreciation for the pursuit of knowledge. Tommy, thinking this was some kind of alien high five, enthusiastically smacked Quill's appendage with his palm. "Yo, what's up, Professor Q?" The silence that followed was the kind that archaeologists might discover preserved in amber millions of years later. Quill's secondary brain, the one responsible for processing social interactions, briefly considered shutting down entirely. And representing Earth, Ambassador Vex continued, her voice carrying just the slightest hint of uncertainty. "Tommy Briggs, student of philosophy." Tommy waved at the audience. "Hey everybody, this is pretty wild, right? I mean, aliens. My mom's not going to believe this. I should probably call her after this, but my phone's been acting up lately. You know how it is." The alien dignitaries exchanged glances, or what passed for glances among species with eyes arranged in configurations that would make a geometry teacher weep. Several began taking notes, though whether they were documenting Tommy's behavior or planning their species' immediate departure from the galaxy was unclear. Quill decided to establish his intellectual dominance early. "Human, before we begin this discourse, I must ask, are you familiar with the fundamental principles of existential epistemology?" Tommy scratched his head. "Is that like knowing stuff about existing?" "Because I exist, so I guess I know something about it. I mean, I woke up this morning, had some cereal, drove here. Pretty sure I exist." Quill paused, his tertiary brain running calculations. "Actually, that's not an entirely incorrect interpretation of the basic premise." Ambassador Vex leaned forward. "Perhaps we should establish the rules of engagement. This debate will explore the nature of universal truth. Each participant will present their understanding of reality, consciousness, and existence. The format will be open discourse, with rebuttals permitted." "Open discourse," Tommy repeated, nodding seriously. "Got it. So like we just talk about stuff?" "The profound nature of existence transcends mere conversation," Quill interjected, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of academic tradition. "We are discussing the fundamental questions that have puzzled the greatest minds across the cosmos for millennia." Tommy considered this. "Cool. I've got questions too. Like, why do we drive on parkways but park on driveways? And if nothing sticks to Teflon, how do they make Teflon stick to the pan?" Ambassador Vex found herself genuinely curious about the Teflon question. She made a note to research it later. "Very well. Professor Nexarian, you may begin." Quill straightened his robes and activated his presentation matrix, causing holographic equations to materialize around him. "Esteemed beings, we gather today to explore the most fundamental question in all of existence. What is truth?" "Oh, I know this one," Tommy said, raising his hand. "Truth is like when you're not lying." The audience stirred. Several alien scholars leaned forward. In 47 civilizations, truth had been defined through complex mathematical theorems, philosophical frameworks, and occasionally, ritual combat. None had ever considered the possibility that truth might simply be the absence of lies. Quill launched into his opening argument with the confidence of someone who'd never lost an intellectual debate. His holographic displays showed interconnected webs of logic, mathematical proofs that reality was a construct of consciousness, and theoretical frameworks that would make Einstein weep with joy. "Reality, as we understand it, exists in multiple dimensional states simultaneously," Quill explained, his voice carrying the authority of absolute certainty. "Truth, therefore, is not a singular concept, but a multifaceted crystalline structure that refracts differently depending on the observer's consciousness wavelength." The alien audience nodded appreciatively. This was the kind of sophisticated reasoning they'd expected from a galactic debate. Tommy, meanwhile, was trying to follow along but kept getting distracted by the pretty lights in Quill's presentation. When Ambassador Vex indicated it was his turn to respond, he cleared his throat. "Okay, so like reality. Yeah, I work at Pete's Pizza Palace, right? And yesterday, this customer comes in and orders a large pepperoni pizza. Simple enough. But then he starts asking me all these questions about whether the pepperoni is real pepperoni or if it's just our perception of pepperoni. And I'm like, dude, nah, it's meat circles. They taste good on pizza. That's pretty much the whole deal." The audience began murmuring. Several of the more advanced species had spent centuries debating the nature of perceived reality versus actual reality. "But here's the thing," Tommy continued, warming to his topic. "When I'm making that pizza, I'm not thinking about whether the dough exists or whatever. I'm thinking about whether the customer's going to be happy with their pizza. Because at the end of the day, that guy's going to eat it. And if it tastes good, then reality worked out pretty well for everybody." Quill's primary brain performed rapid calculations. "You're suggesting that truth is determined by practical outcomes rather than theoretical frameworks?" "I'm suggesting that if you're hungry and I make you a pizza, and you eat it and feel better, then something true just happened. I don't know what you call it, but it worked." Several alien delegates began typing frantically on their recording devices. The Nexarian concept of practical truth had been theoretical for centuries, but no one had ever considered that it might be achieved through food service. Ambassador Vex found herself intrigued. Professor Nexarian, how does your framework address the practical application of truth in daily existence? Quill's confidence wavered slightly. His theories were beautiful, elegant, and had won him countless awards. They were also completely useless for day-to-day living, which had never seemed like a problem until now. Well, the practical applications are implied within the theoretical structure, he said, his holographic displays flickering uncertainly. Implied? Tommy asked. Like you've got all these fancy diagrams and stuff, but you can't use them to make a pizza? Making pizza is not the point of philosophical inquiry. Why not? Tommy asked genuinely. I mean, people gotta eat. And if your philosophy can't help people eat, or be happy, or figure out why their phone keeps freezing, then what's it actually doing? The audience was now completely focused on Tommy. In the back row, a delegation from the Crab Nebula was furiously taking notes. Their civilization had spent millennia developing philosophical frameworks that had no practical application whatsoever, and they were beginning to suspect they'd been doing it wrong. Bill decided to escalate. If practical philosophy was the game, he'd demonstrate the superiority of advanced theoretical thinking by tackling consciousness itself. Let us examine the nature of consciousness, he announced, his displays now showing complex neural networks and quantum probability matrices. Consciousness exists as a quantum phenomenon, simultaneously observing and creating reality through the collapse of probability waves into definite states. The audience leaned forward. This was exactly the kind of sophisticated discourse they'd expected. Tommy raised his hand. Can I tell you about my goldfish? Your goldfish? Yeah, his name's Steve. So I'm watching Steve swim around in his bowl, right? And I'm thinking, does Steve know he's in a bowl? Like his whole universe is this glass circle with a little castle and some fake plants. But Steve seems pretty happy. He eats his food, he swims around, he does his goldfish thing. Bell's antennae twitched impatiently. What does this have to do with consciousness? Well, maybe we're all just Steves. Maybe there's some giant alien watching us swim around in our solar system bowl, wondering if we know we're in a bowl. But here's the thing, Steve doesn't seem worried about it. He just keeps being a goldfish. The delegate from Proxima Centauri dropped her stylus. Their entire civilization was built around the anxiety of not knowing their place in the universe, and this human was suggesting they might be overthinking it. Tommy continued, and then I realized something. My grandmother used to say that worrying about things you can't control is like trying to solve a puzzle with half the pieces missing. You can drive yourself crazy, or you can just work with what you've got. That's actually quite profound, admitted a scholar from the Andromeda delegation. Quill's confidence cracked visibly. But without understanding the fundamental nature of consciousness, how can we make informed decisions about existence? Oh, I make informed decisions all the time, Tommy said cheerfully. Like I decided to put pineapple on pizza last week. People got really mad about it. But you know what? It tasted good to me. And I figured if I'm going to exist, I might as well exist eating food I enjoy. The audience erupted in discussion. The pineapple on pizza debate had apparently reached interstellar proportions, with several species having fought wars over similar culinary philosophy questions. The point is, Tommy continued, maybe consciousness isn't something you figure out. Maybe it's something you just do. Like Steve doesn't need to understand consciousness to be conscious. He just swims around being Steve. Quill's most advanced cognitive processes began showing signs of strain. But surely you must acknowledge that without theoretical frameworks we cannot advance our understanding of. Understanding of what? Tommy interrupted. I mean, we understand that we're here, talking to each other. We understand that some of you traveled across space to have this conversation. We understand that I'm probably going to be hungry later. What more do we need to understand before we can just get on with existing? Ambassador Vex noticed that her recording equipment was overheating from the furious note-taking happening throughout the audience, The Galactic Academic Council's most fundamental assumptions about intelligence and wisdom were being challenged by a pizza delivery driver who'd learned philosophy from his grandmother. Quill realized he was losing control of the debate. His centuries of academic training kicked in, and he deployed his ultimate weapon, the question that could not be answered. "Human," he said, his voice carrying the weight of cosmic authority. "If you believe existence is so simple, then answer this. Why is there something instead of nothing? Why does anything exist at all?" The audience fell silent. This was the question that had stumped the greatest minds in the galaxy. Civilizations had risen and fallen pondering it. Wars had been fought over competing theories. It was the ultimate test of philosophical understanding. Tommy thought for a moment. "Oh man, I actually know this one. So last month I got locked out of my apartment, right? And I'm sitting on the steps at like 2 in the morning, and I'm thinking, what if I'm not really locked out? What if the apartment doesn't exist? What if I don't exist? What if nothing exists?" Quill's eyes brightened. Finally, the human would demonstrate the futility of his simplistic approach. "And I'm sitting there having this whole crisis about whether anything is real," Tommy continued. "But then I realized something. I was cold. Like really cold. And whether or not cold exists as a concept, or whether my perception of cold is just electrical signals in my brain or whatever, I was still cold. And being cold sucked." The audience was completely silent now. "So I figured, even if nothing exists, I still don't want to be cold. And if I don't exist, then at least the nothing that's pretending to be me doesn't want to be cold. So I called my neighbor, and she let me crash on her couch." Tommy paused, gathering his thoughts. "And lying there on her couch, I thought maybe things exist because not existing would be uncomfortable. Like maybe the universe is just trying to find a comfortable place to sleep." The silence stretched on for what felt like geological ages. In the back row, the delegate from the Philosophers Guild was having what could only be described as a spiritual experience. "You're suggesting," Quill said slowly, "that existence itself is driven by comfort-seeking behavior?" "I'm suggesting that maybe we're overthinking it," Tommy replied. "I mean, you guys traveled across the galaxy to have this conversation. That's pretty cool. You must have wanted to have it, right? So maybe things exist because they want to. Because existing is more interesting than not existing." Ambassador Vex realized she was witnessing something unprecedented. In 47 civilizations, existence had been explained through mathematical necessity, divine intervention, or cosmic accident. None had ever considered that existence might be a choice made by existence itself. Quill's world was crumbling around him. His theories, his awards, his entire understanding of the universe, all of it was being casually dismantled by a community college student who'd learned philosophy from being locked out of his apartment. But Quill whispered, "If existence is just a preference, then what's the point of all our theories? All our research? All our attempts to understand?" Tommy shrugged. "Maybe understanding is just another way of existing. Like you exist by thinking about stuff, and I exist by making pizza. Steve exists by swimming around. My neighbor exists by being nice to locked-out people. We're all just finding different ways to be comfortable being here." The audience realized they were witnessing the solution to a 1,000-year-old philosophical puzzle, delivered by someone who'd never even considered it a puzzle to begin with. The aftermath of Tommy's victory was unlike anything in galactic academic history. Ambassador Vex stood before the assembled delegates, her expression somewhere between bewilderment and admiration. After careful consideration, she announced, "The Galactic Academic Council recognizes that Earth has demonstrated a unique and valuable perspective on universal truth. Earth's application for membership in the Galactic Academic Union is hereby approved." The audience erupted in applause, tentacles clapping, eye stalks blinking in approval, and various breathing apparatus making sounds that might have been cheering in languages that didn't have words for what they'd just witnessed. Tommy, still not entirely sure what had just happened, raised his hand. "So does this mean I passed? Because I've got a shift at Pete's in like an hour." Quill sat in stunned silence at his podium. His entire worldview had been reorganized by a human who'd used goldfish care as a metaphor for existential philosophy. His academic pride warred with a growing sense that maybe, just maybe, he'd been missing something important. Professor Nexarian, Ambassador Vex said gently, "Are you quite all right?" Quill looked up at her, then at Tommy, then at the audience of beings who were still discussing the revolutionary implications of comfort-based existence theory. "I have 47 degrees," he said quietly. "I've published 12,000 papers. I've won every major award in theoretical philosophy. And I just lost a debate to someone who thinks existence is like finding a comfortable place to sleep." "Hey," Tommy said, "nothing wrong with sleep. Sleep's great. You know what's not great? Being tired all the time because you're worried about whether your bed is real or not. Sometimes you just gotta lie down and get some rest." And somehow that made perfect sense. 3 months later, Tommy received a formal invitation to join the faculty of the Galactic Academy as the first professor of applied illogical logic. The position came with a substantial salary, comprehensive health benefits, and unlimited access to the Academy's legendary cafeteria, which served pizza from 17 different worlds. Will, meanwhile, had taken a sabbatical to reassess his fundamental assumptions about existence. He'd started by getting a job at a local coffee shop, where he was slowly learning that sometimes the best philosophy happened when you were just trying to make someone's day a little better with a good cup of coffee. The Galactic Academic Union, for its part, had established the Tommy Briggs Memorial Prize for Accidental Wisdom, awarded annually to the being who most successfully solved complex problems by completely ignoring their complexity. And somewhere in a small apartment in Riverside, California, a goldfish named Steve continued swimming around his bowl, blissfully unaware that he'd become a galactic symbol of enlightened consciousness. He was, by all accounts, still perfectly happy just being a goldfish. Earth's membership in the Galactic Academic Union opened up unprecedented opportunities for cultural and intellectual exchange. Human philosophers began traveling to distant worlds to share their wisdom, which largely consisted of common sense delivered with the confidence of people who'd never considered that common sense might be uncommon. The universe, it turned out, had been waiting for someone to point out that maybe the answers to life's biggest questions weren't hidden in complex theories or ancient texts. Maybe they were right there in front of everyone. As obvious as hunger, as simple as kindness, as comfortable as finding a place to sleep. And if that wasn't truth, it was at least close enough to make everyone feel better about existing. Tommy still worked at Pete's Pizza Palace, but now he was also the galaxy's first professor of applied illogical logic. He split his time between teaching alien civilizations about the philosophical implications of food service and making sure Steve had enough food. It was, by all accounts, a pretty good way to exist.